we're particularly delighted to have Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi with us tonight. He's been brought to Australia for a speaking tour by the Australian Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, and we've cooperated on a number of things in the past, and a couple of representatives from AJAC are here, and we're pleased to be able to do this, and thank you very much again. Dr. Ottolenghi is a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies based in Brussels. He's a leader for his work on Iran. He has advised, and of course Iran is one of those topics du jour these days. If it's not European crisis, it's what's happening between Iran and its neighbours and so on, and well, I guess we'll hear a lot more about that tonight. He's advised several foreign ministries in Europe and testified before the Canadian and European parliaments. Dr. Ottolenghi's extensive research has exposed the connections between Iran's energy companies and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the paramilitary organisation responsible for the regime's political repression and international terrorism activities. Among Dr. Ottolenghi's other areas of expertise are Israel's domestic policies, constitutional issues, political trends and elections, the Arab-Israeli conflict, terrorism and security, the Italian foreign policy, the EU's Middle East policymaking and transatlantic relations. He's the author of Iran, the Looming Crisis, Can the West Live with Iran's Nuclear Threat? And Under a Mushroom Cloud, Europe, Iran and the Bomb, and his most recent book, The Path to Iran Inside Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which I mentioned before. He headed the Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, where he resides, and taught Israel Studies at St Anthony's College, Oxford. He obtained his PhD in political theory at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, preceded by undergraduate studies in political science at the University of Bologna. The topic, as we've advertised for tonight, is From Tehran to Tahrir Square, Is Freedom Really Sweeping the Middle East? And that's a question I think we all want to know something about. So, Dr. Ottolenghi.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's great to be here tonight, and it's great to be in Sydney. Just in case you didn't know, you live in paradise, so I hope you pay attention to it. For people who make the journey all the way to Europe and come here, it's quite a remarkable thing to find. I reside in Brussels, which looks very different, especially these days. We are consumed by the Euro debt crisis, and so we've been a little distracted by our own problems and not paying full attention to what's been happening across the pond, our own pond, what the Romans used to call Mare Nostrum, our own sea, the Mediterranean, where something unprecedented has been happening in the last year or so. I think that if you asked anyone who does the Middle East in November of 2010, what was the most stable regime in the Arab world, the answer would have been Tunisia. And of course, 2 months later, the most stable regime in the Arab world was gone. And it was gone in a way that nobody had expected would materialize. It's interesting because for a decade now, many observers and scholars of the Middle East had noticed that you had a number of elements, dysfunctional elements in the societies and the political systems of the Middle East, which suggested that the existing order was untenable. Actually, the argument, or one of the underlying arguments for the dramatic change in U.S. foreign policy after September 11, which, basically was an argument for regime change across the region, relied upon those arguments that something quite dysfunctional was happening in the Middle East, which required a dramatic democratic change. The elements which, of course, everybody noticed were the economic stagnation of societies, the unparalleled youth bulge you had in Middle East society, so this huge and ever-growing number of youngsters who joined the workforce or the labor market every year in an economic context that was unable to create jobs and provide for income for this mass of new workers, with the attendant consequences, of course, in such societies where, for example, men need to have a certain level of wealth available if they want to marry and establish a family. And of course, societies that do not have the same level of welfare made available by the state to its own people to make ends meet when things are not going well. So you had a youth bulge, and of course, students of history would add to this analysis that whenever you have a very young society with dysfunctional economic or socioeconomic conditions, you have the potential for revolution available. On top of these dysfunctional elements, you had widespread political repression. You had political systems which were once the product of a very vital and appealing revolutionary ideology, namely Pan-Arabism. But these regimes had over time morphed into republican autocracies run by families. In Arabic, the word for republic is Jumhuriya, and the word for monarchy is Mamlukiya, and Arabs jokingly refer to regimes such as Mubarak in Egypt and Assad in Syria as Jumlukiya, i.e. you put the two words together because these formal Arab republics, based on the call for pan-Arab progressive nationalism, had morphed into despotic family-run dictatorships, which had pretty much ossified. So you had dysfunctional political systems, you had demographic challenge, you had stagnating economies, and you had, of course, as a byproduct of all of this, a lack of social upward and downward mobility, which meant that if you were on the wrong side of the political and socioeconomic divide in the country, you stood no chances. And several analysts, of course, in the early 2000s, especially after the shock of 9/11, assumed and analyzed and opined that these factors, of course, had provided fertile ground for radicalism, and for the kind of radicalism, Islamic-infused radicalism, that had produced 9/11. So the response, of course, and the prescription had been in certain quarters of US foreign policy circles, and to a lesser extent European and other Western circles, was to promote democracy. That the answer was, these political systems cannot work, these political systems are doomed, these societies are dysfunctional, you need to create prosperity, you need to create jobs, you need to create more freedom to do that, you need to open up societies, you need to liberalize, etc., etc., etc. So in a sense, you already had a diagnosis of the problem, and observers of the Middle East in the last decade had seen this coming. And yet, nobody had seen it coming at the same time. In other words, we all assumed that these problems were there, and incidentally, some of these problems were accurately, eloquently, and extensively analyzed in the United Nations Arab Human Development Reports, which were published between 2002 and 2005. But nobody expected that the consequence of this dysfunctional situation with despotic regimes, stagnating economies, demographic time bombs, and socio-political injustice would trigger the kind of sweeping changes we've seen in the last 16 months. It came as a surprise, and it shouldn't have. It's interesting, though, that it happened the way it happened. First of all, again, of all the countries of the Middle East that you think of in terms of influence, and I'm not just talking about political influence, I'm talking about cultural influence, the place you would have expected to trigger the sparkle of revolution would have been Egypt. Egypt is the most populous Arab country. Egypt has been at the forefront of change in the region. Egypt is the country that gave birth to pan-Arab nationalism. Egypt was the regional leader, is the seat of the Arab League. Egyptian literature, Egyptian television, Egyptian culture permeates the Arab world. Egyptian Arabic is the most accepted medium across a world that speaks formally the same language, but increasingly with significant variations that make the westernmost Arabic not entirely intelligible to the easternmost one you find in the Gulf. So you had something going, and you expected it to happen in Egypt if it were to happen. But you also had regimes that had mastered, among all of their dysfunctions, had mastered the art of repression. If there was one thing that these governments knew how to do well, it wasn't producing wealth, it wasn't scientific breakthroughs, it wasn't functioning health systems and so on, it was repression. They knew how to do that. And it's therefore remarkable that these regimes were swept away so quickly. And certainly in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, relatively painlessly. Now, as these revolutions caught on, the Western response after the initial shock and surprise was to start dubbing them as the Arab Spring. And the reason I think why the term was first used and quickly stuck is because certainly we Europeans experienced a similar spring 21 years before, and we believed there were parallels, that what was happening in the Arab world was what happened in Eastern Europe and Central Europe in 1989. And of course, again, if you go and look at the debate and the discussions in the early 90s after communism collapsed in Eastern Europe and democracy ensued, one of the questions that people frequently were asking was, democracy has come to Eastern Europe, democracy is coming to Africa, democracy has come to Southeast Asia, democracy has come to Latin America. Why is it that the Arab world is the only place where democracy's wave has failed to hit the shores? And so it came out as a logical analysis and analogy to say, well, there's been some delay, but this is the Arab wave of democracy. Now, I think that there is something truly remarkable and unprecedented in what has happened across the Arab world in the last year and a half. And I certainly think that the fact that you have had, at least in some of these societies, largely nonviolent protests calling for an opening up of the system, relatively free and fair elections, and an opening up of civil society is promising. At the same time, I have to say that the fact that the political forces that were least likely to subscribe to liberal democratic values have won elections in the places where we have had elections so far should give us reason to pause. First point. Second point, we have grown accustomed to call the Arab world, as if the Arab world was politically, socioeconomically, demographically, ethnically, culturally, historically, geographically, one place. As if to say, you have an Arab world like you have an English world, and they share, both in their own way, a number of common traits which are more important in defining them than the differences that characterize them. Now, that may be true of the English world, and yet you can still find significant enough differences between the United States, South Africa, Australia, and Canada, and not to mention some English-speaking countries in Africa, that concept may be more of a cultural construct than a political one. But in the case of the Arab world, I think we have been misled significantly for years by the rhetoric of Arab nationalism to assume that countries, from Morocco to the Arab Gulf had much more in common than a language and only to some extent a shared religion. The fact of the matter is you need to look at these countries one by one and recognize that they all are responding to the pressure of change in a very different way, and that the causes of change to some extent are also different. First of all, there is a significant difference in the way these countries have responded to internal pressure, whether they are monarchies or Arab republics, and whether they are relatively homogeneous societies or they are a political construct where an ethnic or religious minority dominates a majority that belongs to a different faith or a different branch of Islam, or a patchwork, a mosaic of ethnic groups. The places where change has been the least violent and the swiftest are the places that were homogeneous: Egypt and Tunisia. Every other place that was an autocracy of some kind or another, ruling over a patchwork and mosaic of ethnic groups and minorities, you have had a descent into sectarian violence. And again, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Bahrain are evidence of how much more difficult it has been for the rulers and the ruled to get over their differences, and how much stronger the incentive has been for rulers to hold on to power in places where such sectarian or religious or ethnic differences were more pronounced. And they are important factors for these countries in the way forward. The second point is the distinction between republics and monarchies. With all the shortcomings that we can attribute to Arab monarchies, certainly in the Gulf, and perhaps with more question marks and problems in Jordan and Morocco, these countries, with one exception possibly of being Bahrain, have fared a lot better. First of all, some of them have not had the same degree of unrest that we've seen in the Arab republics. Second of all, they have managed to address the underlying demands and tensions that exploded through demonstration, protest in a much more effective way. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there a common lesson to be learned, first of all, in all of these movements? And I don't think there is one, except perhaps a demand that stems less from the desire to enjoy the kind of political and human freedoms that we deem self-evident for a free society in the West, and more a demand for more dignity, more access to jobs, and the ability to provide for family, and a slightly better defined, different, and more respectful relation between the rulers and the ruled. Now, these are not demands that are contradictory to liberal democracy and freedom as we understand it in the West, but they're not necessarily demands that lead to that kind of system. One of the reasons why monarchies have actually fared better is because their political structure and the political order that they represent enjoys a certain degree of legitimacy in their own societies. And especially if you look at Gulf countries are societies, despite the apparent glitz of Disneyland in the desert that you have in some parts of the Gulf these days, these societies remain profoundly conservative. For them, a well-functioning, well-structured social order remains a priority over the kind of chaos in their mind that exists in our own open societies. And the fact that they tolerate a certain degree of such openness on their shores, especially in places like the United Arab Emirates, does not mean that they want that kind of lifestyle and those values for themselves. And they tolerate and accept it within certain narrowly defined parameters for foreigners, but not for themselves. So you have important and significant differences. And I don't think that we have to therefore read into what happened in the last 15 months the message that some people have been putting out, namely that now that the dictatorships are gone, democracy, as we understand it in the West, will inevitably spring forth. Second point, I mentioned briefly the kind of political forces that have won where there have been elections. If you look at the history of the Arab world went through various phases from the period before and during World War II, when it was only partially free and when it was still significantly pre-modern, where the curse and blessing of oil, certainly in the Gulf, had not fully materialized, where in the more modernizing countries you had attempts to create some resemblance of constitutional monarchies with support for liberalism and parliamentary democracy, but that was supplanted in the 50s by Arab nationalism, an Arab nationalism that embraced a political model that was modernizing very fast while subscribing to principles of socialism of the national variety that the emerging world pretty much adopted everywhere. During all of that time, Arab nationalism competed with an alternative model of politics in the Arab world, which was Islamic, of course. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in Egypt in the 1920s, was a response to modernization and foreign presence, and sought to offer an alternative political model to these societies. Arab nationalism defeated or cornered the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly in Egypt, but also in other parts of the Arab world between the 50s and the 80s, oftentimes at a very high political cost, with violent repressions and persecutions. Assad in 92 in Hama, Nasser going after the Brotherhood in the 50s, and so on. Arab nationalism lost its vitality after its defeat in 1967 against Israel. It continued to survive through dictatorships, but as a political ideology, it lost its vitality and its appeal in the Arab world. The Muslim Brotherhood and its ideology remained largely checked by the dictatorship until very recently. But today, the Muslim Brotherhood and the ideology represents are perhaps the strongest, the best organized, and the most vital political organization and political idea in the Arab world. And because they were never allowed the test of government in the Arab world, they are a very attractive alternative and also a very effective one in mobilizing support among the masses. The fact of the matter is, political Islam has only been tested at the periphery of the Arab world in 3 countries: Afghanistan, Iran, and Sudan. The only other place where it could have been tested, Algeria, it was not allowed to govern, and we know how the Algerian story ended. So therefore, it makes only perfect sense that the Muslim Brotherhood, having advocated for 70, 80 years a certain political model and a certain political idea, having remained the only well-organized opposition to dictatorship and repression in vast parts of the Arab world until this very day, given the chance to govern, will try to implement its own vision. And I hear the arguments of a lot of people, certainly in Europe, but also elsewhere, who say, look, the Muslim Brotherhood is a modernizing movement. They have been exposed to Western ideas. They are painfully aware of the cost of political violence. They have made a choice to forego violence for their own interest, and they've chosen the peaceful way to power. They will have to deal with the very practical, mundane challenges and choices of governance, and therefore it's only good that they get into government, because that will tame them, will make them more pragmatic, and over the course of the next few years, they will become an Islamic version of Christian Democrats. Now, I hope that that is what is going to happen. But I have my doubts. And the point really is that the underlying socioeconomic conditions and the political culture of these societies is not very conducive, at least in the short term, to this kind of transition. The Muslim Brotherhood has come to power in Egypt and in Tunisia with a sense of vindication for its own ideology, worldview, and history. And I think that they will try and implement their vision to prove themselves right historically and ideologically. And the only possible way that you can move from the current situation to one where the Muslim Brotherhood becomes a tamed Islamic version of Christian Democrats playing democracy is that their model is applied and it fails. And it will be a bumpy ride. And if you want, again, an example of how that could work out and why ideologues thinking that history is behind them and giving them full support and vindication are not prone to compromising their ideology even in the face of economic adversities, look at Iran. I mentioned in the title of my lecture, of course, Tehran, because some people will argue that the wave of democratization and popular protest against dictatorial regimes in the region actually began with the protests against the fraudulent presidential elections of 2009 in Iran. And Iran is a great example where you can see how the ideology of political Islam, even in its Persian Shia version, once it comes into power, does not get tamed by the necessities of governance and the realities of power. If anything, we have seen throughout the history of the Islamic Republic that these ideology and the people who subscribe to it are willing to sacrifice what we think would be a reasonable approach to and the right road to prosperity and happiness in society in the name of an oppressive ideology. They have done it for over 30 years now, and they have chosen to confront and challenge the world in the pursuit of the ultimate weapon of mass destruction and power in order to enhance their ability not only to retain power and maintain the stronghold over their own country through their ideological system, but also as a way to export it abroad. So if I have to take a look at the region from Iran, where the brief moment where we hoped that the Iranian people would get rid of the Islamic Republic and bring about a veritable change inside their country, to the moment when courageous Arab people have done the same in their own countries, I must conclude that the region does not offer much hope for the sweeping of democracy and freedom within the short term. Many of the protests in these countries came out of profound dysfunctional economic conditions and an understanding and genuine yearning for more economic and social justice in these countries. But the fact that these revolutions have toppled the dictators does not mean that the newcomers into power have the means, the tools, the understandings, let alone the will to actually carry out the kind of policies which will bring prosperity. If you again look at Egypt, where the tourist industry has lost over 30% of its revenue in the last year because of turmoil and lack of security and violence and so on. Look at the devaluation of their currency, the flight of capital from Egypt, the the drastic reduction of foreign investment, you see that Egypt is walking into a dramatic economic crisis, which is a great recipe not for liberalization and freedom, but for populism and radicalization. Furthermore, look at these societies, even the relatively homogeneous ones as Egypt, and ask yourself in terms of democracy, are these societies faring better or worse than their predecessors? Are these new governments faring better or worse than their predecessors? And I would suggest to you that one way to look at this and give an answer is to look at how religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and as we call it in my own country, the gentler sex, are treated. Women, Christians, and non-Arabs in these newly found Arab democracies are faring worse than they were faring before. We have had already a decade of experience with electoral politics and coalition politics and democratization in Iraq. The Christian community in Iraq has dwindled to very small numbers from a once thriving community which was one of the oldest Christian communities in the Middle East. Egyptian Copts are under threat and are voting with their feet by leaving the country. The Holy Land, you can see that Christians in the West Bank and Gaza are doing the same. They're under severe restrictions. They're fearing for their ability to practice freely in the land where Jesus was born. And the only place really where the Christian community is able to be free and is thriving and is growing in numbers is actually in Israel. So all across the Middle East, with possibly the exception of Lebanon and the Gulf countries, Christian minorities are suffering profoundly and are much less safe under the newly found conditions of pluralism and freedom than they were under dictatorship. Look at Syria, where, of course, the game is not over yet, and what you see is, perhaps strong of the experience of Iraq, Christian minorities are not, running enthusiastically to embrace the opposition, because with all the shortcomings that this regime had, and there are many, of course, this regime, like many other Arab dictatorships, offered protection, not equal rights, of course, but protection to religious minorities. And in the midst of all of this, of course, we can see that in countries where ethnic minorities exist alongside religious minorities, there is very little willingness of the new regimes to recognize the ethnic minorities and give them an equal saying and standing within society. Think of the Berbers, think of the Kurds, just as two examples of this. And finally, of course, one of the things we are going to see, I suspect, in these societies as Islamic parties become more influential and come into government is an increased social pressure on women to conform to modesty codes. So these are not signs of a movement towards freedom and more significant openness. I am not saying, of course, that unless Egypt and Tunisia pass laws allowing topless beaches and gay marriage within the next 6 months, they cannot be qualified as democracies. We have to be aware of the social sensitivities of a region which I defined at the beginning of my talk as still very conservative. But at the same time, it should be a basic tenet of a democracy that civil rights are respected, that equality is granted to all, and that people, individuals, and groups within society can live freely with the absence of fear in their own society. And what you have in these societies as a result of change is that the old fear from dictatorship has been replaced with a new fear, especially within these groups. And that's not a promising sign for democracy. So I think that when you take it as a whole, you realize that the changes that have occurred have some potential way down along the road in the next few decades, but that the ride will be very bumpy, and we should be very skeptical to call them democracies so far. We have to give a chance, and we have to support the Democrats and the liberals within these countries who want to bring about genuine pluralism, but we should be under no illusions. When the new regimes start arresting activists whose only crime is to support civil society and train people in the art of democratic practice and democratic governance, you know that something is going very wrong.